Welcome to Journey to Justice. I'm Eiko Kosasa, your host. Recently at the 2012 Kalaho'iho'i'ea, or Sovereignty Restoration Day event, I interviewed Dr. Noelani Goodyear-Ka'opua, an associate professor of political science at the University of Hawai'i-Manoa. Noelani merges her interests in education, nation building, and activism into her courses. Co-founder of Halau Ku Mana, a Hawaiian culture-based public school, charter school, Noelani discusses the different influences in her life. I began the interview by asking her where she was born and raised.
I was born here in Honolulu and raised primarily back and forth between the ahupua of He'eia and Kalihi. And so my popo, my mom's mom, lived in Kalihi on the corner of School and Leilani Streets. And that's where my mom grew up, and I spent a lot of time in that house with my popo growing up. She was a really important force in raising me. And then my parents lived in He'eia, right near, right off of Kaneohe Bay, not on the bay, but nearby. We could walk to the bay from our house. Yeah.
So where did you go to school?
So I went to school at Kamehameha from kindergarten through 12th grade, and I graduated in 1992. So it was a really exciting time to be coming out of high school and becoming an adult. Yeah.
Because of the movement.
Because of what was going on. Yeah, at the time. In fact, I remember being at Kamehameha the very first time I heard the word sovereignty. It was apparently some of the Hawaiian history teachers had really fought hard to have this panel as an after-school optional thing that students could come to. And so Mililani Trask was on the panel, and Lily Kala Kume'elehiva was on the panel. Someone from OHA that I can't remember now, but those two women in particular really made an impact on me. And I can't remember which one of them, but one of them, had gone first and was talking about sovereignty, and all of a sudden things like clicked. I was like, wow, that's it. That's what we're supposed to be, thinking about. But it wasn't something that we learned much about or talked about at all at Kamehameha, even though it was coming up to that 100th anniversary of the overthrow.
Yeah. And afterwards, I think you went to University of Hawaii, right?
Yeah, I actually went away for a year. So like many of us at Kamehameha, I was encouraged to go away. I was a fairly good student, so I was really pushed to, that was how you showed that you're successful, right? To go away to college. So I went away to school in Los Angeles for a year, and I actually missed the Onipa'a March because I was at school, and I thought, what am I doing thousands of miles away from home? There's so much going on at home that I need to be there for. And so after that first year, I came home and did what I had really been wanting to do in my na'au, for as I finished high school, which was to be in Hawaiian Studies. And so I entered Hawaiian Studies in the fall of 1993 at UH Manoa, and it was a fabulous time to be there.
And even it brought together the culture and politics.
Yeah, and it was, the education was so relevant because it was very connected to everything that was happening in our communities, on the streets. It wasn't like we were just sitting in a classroom and learning something, but we were sitting in a classroom and learning and discussing ideas, and then with the same groups of people would be talking about how to organize students on campus or how to be in solidarity with communities off campus. That summer, prior to me starting at UH as a sophomore, was the summer that the tribunal was held. So I got to go to all of those hearings as part of Kaho'okolo Nui Kanaka Maoli. So it was just, my education felt alive in a way that it had never felt before, even though I had been a good student and liked school at Kamehameha, I didn't completely know why I was doing it, other than that's what you do, you be a good student, you be successful, get a good job, etc.
Didn't you speak at a rally? I was just thinking, was it on 50% of the tuition or something, and we're down at the Capitol.
Yeah.
And you were the student speaker, and you were just an undergraduate then, right?
Yeah, I was an undergraduate, and we had a coalition that we called Scrub, Student Coalition for a Responsible University Budget. So that was when we marched all the way from the campus down to the Capitol, and I think I got to be one of, or maybe the undergraduate speaker.
And what did you
that
think?
Event.
I mean, to speak and you're an undergraduate.
I think at that time, I'm sure I was nervous, but by that time I was later in my university career, and I had been so surrounded by a lot of student activism. You know, there was a lot of student activism in Hawaiian Studies just before I came in, and then while I was there and after. So it wasn't something that seemed odd. It just seemed like that's what you do when you're at the university. You participate in political life, both in things that impact the university and impact the larger communities. And that's sort of, I mean, it's kind of how I was born. My parents were actually undergrads at UH when they met. So they were ASUH senators together, which is, my dad was an international student, and my mom was born and raised in Kalihi, Hawaiian Chinese. And she was involved with the beginning of ethnic studies as a TA. She was one of the TAs and students involved in organizing. And so I was conceived when they were undergrads, and remember as a toddler, sort of faint images of going to things with them.
So when you started to become active, you had their natural support, right?
Yeah, I was lucky in that way. I know other people didn't necessarily have, families that supported students being active. But
then later you went to University of California at Santa Cruz, right?
Yeah, that was
consciousness
later. Yeah, after for grad school.
Yeah, and how did you make that decision? Since everything was happening here.
Here,
and stuff,
yeah.
right?
So I left in '98, and I knew that it was a temporary leave. I wasn't planning to stay there, but I felt like I had gotten so much out of my education at UH in Hawaiian Studies and Political Science, but that there was more that I needed to gain from outside in order to kind of think about Hawaiian politics differently and in new ways. And so I actually got a chance to meet Angela Davis through Haunani K. Trask. Right. Angela had come and spoke at the university, and then she was one of the faculty members at the program where I went to school, and so I ended up going there.
And so did you study under her at all, or take
I took
class?
classes with her. Yeah, I did. That was really amazing because she was so brilliant and so grounded at the same time, and she was somebody whose career I could really see as a model for who had had a lot of academic success and really used her analysis of race and class and gender in ways that benefit communities. She had stayed very grounded in anti-prison organizing, for example, for her entire career.
Right.
Yeah, so that was exciting to be able to work with her. But I knew that it was going to just be a few years and then I would be home.
Yeah. But now you're a professor at the university. So did you think about that after you graduate, or while you're going to graduate school, to go into education? I mean, what are your thoughts on education?
Well, I'd always been really interested in being a teacher. I think partially because I had a lot of good teachers growing up, both in high school and at the university. I mean, when I was at UH, I had teachers who just completely changed my life in many ways. So Haunani K was one of them. Kanalu Young, John Osorio, Lily Kala, all the Hawaiian Studies faculty, as well as Hawaiian language faculty and political science faculty. I mean, they just changed the way I thought they influenced the way I thought in so many ways. And like I said, particularly being in Hawaiian Studies, it being the education that we were receiving being so relevant to what was happening in the community at the time, and that was such a contrast to the kind of education that I had come out of at Kamehameha. And then I also worked, like I did, all of my summer jobs were different kinds of teaching jobs because I was just always drawn to the teaching profession. So whether it was teaching swimming to little kids or supervising A+, those were kind of some of the first things that I did. And then a really transformational moment for me was when I did, I taught a summer program at Honolulu Community College for Hawaiian students who were going into their senior year of high school. And so it was the beginning of a bridge program to encourage them to come into college. It's called Po'ina Nalu. And all of the students, 99% of them came from public schools. And I had spent my whole life in a private school, which we're very privileged up at Kamehameha, with the kind of resources that we had are available to us. And so, but being around these students, I felt like I related to them in ways that I didn't relate to some of my own classmates. I don't know why. Maybe it was just because of the backgrounds that we had growing up or whatnot. But the thing that was about them was that it was a writing class. It was an applied English class, which I think typically at the community college level, they encouraged us to teach the students how to write like letters and fill out job applications and that kind of stuff. And we ended up teaching it totally differently and more as sort of a focus on Hawaiian and local literature and like the liberatory power of telling our own stories kind of a thing. And they just loved it and they were brilliant, but they didn't necessarily think that they were smart from this whole experience in the public school system. And so me and the Keola Nakanishi, who was co-teaching with me at the time, we kind of were like, wow, we need to take this and do it on a bigger scale, not just for a summer, but be able to impact the experience that students are having throughout their whole time in school. And most of our people are in public schools. So we knew that Kamehameha is fine. We didn't necessarily need to help on that end, even though, there are things that need to be done at Kamehameha as well. But we really wanted to focus our attention on public education. And kind of as we were talking about all of these things and just kind of really dreaming about what could be different, we got a chance to meet in 1999 Ku Kakalau and Nale Kakalau, yeah. And they were already doing what we had been talking about on like a scale, much grander, and we're having amazing successes. And so we got really fired up by their example and their leadership. And they mentioned that, they were going around to various islands telling people about the charter school law that had recently been passed by the Hawaii State Legislature. And they were saying, Hawaiian communities have to jump on this opportunity, because if we don't, then it's going to be, affluent communities that are going to want to create schools of choice so that their students can move to these schools out of the larger mainstream schools. And this is an opportunity for us to have some measure of autonomy over the way our kids are educated. And so we thought, this is a really cool idea. Maybe when we're done grad school and after, maybe like 15, 20 years, when we're 40 or something, we'll do that. Sounds great. And we were, I guess, more than gently encouraged. We were strongly encouraged that you needed to take action now, because the window for submitting letters of intent to start charter schools was only within that year.
Really?
So neither of us had finished grad school yet. We were still in our mid-20s, but it was kind of like sometimes your kuleana just gets given to you, and so that was what the kuleana that we were kind of given. And and so that's how Halau Ku Mana or that's how we became involved in this larger community movement to build Halau Ku Mana.
Wow, yeah, because you ended up being the principal.
I was, for a time, the program director and the local school board member and chair.
So it went from, how many students did you have there?
It's still a relatively small school. We started with 65, and the school is still just right about 100, maybe a little over 100.
That's a lot of students.
It's a small,
Because
yeah,
they're speaking in Hawaiian. Aren't they learning in Hawaiian? Or both?
It's a Hawaiian culture-based school, and all the students take Hawaiian language, but the medium of instruction is primarily English with a strong Hawaiian component as well. We've always aimed to kind of move toward being bilingual. So I'm not at the school formally anymore, but my daughter is a student. So now I'm just a parent of.
Yeah. You're the parent's point
Yeah.
of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I know you wanted to talk about, did you want to talk about the role, the Native Hawaiian role? I mean, this is kind of a jump, but.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I experienced in having worked with Halau Ku Mana for that period of time was that young people were really fired up about learning about our history, and there was a lot of curriculum resources that the generation of scholars before me has done to document and analyze the history of the 19th century in Hawaii, but there was much less in terms of resources to document the struggle that they actually were a part of. So all of that late 20th century Hawaiian struggle that allowed for things like charter schools, Hawaiian immersion schools, the Center for Hawaiian Studies, all of that kind of stuff, there's a lot less documentation of that, and so the young people kind of just see those institutions and take them for granted.
That's right.
And so one of the things that we were noticing was the need to have those stories be told. For example, you know, the whole struggle around the effort to save Kaho'olawe from the Navy's bombing and then restore and green the island. That was a struggle that people had sort of a faint idea of, but not in the same way that someone of my generation would have remembered, because, you know, we had our parents and aunties and uncles and everybody telling us about, you know, all of these occupations and whatnot. So we started this project called the Mo'olelo Aloha Aina project, which was envisioned to be a web-based video archive that would have oral history clips from people who actually participated in Hawaiian land struggles. So we started off interviewing people who were part of the early non-sanctioned occupations on Kaho'olawe. So the other thing we were kind of seeing in the way that the history of Kaho'olawe was being remembered was that from the 1980 consent decree on, when the Navy did allow people to come on the island, it was easier to access that history. But the early occupations that, you know, people made that weren't sanctioned was more difficult to access. And those people are still alive, you know, many of those people are still alive. So we were wanting to be able to capture some of those stories and experiences so that young people could hear them and that they could also participate in the process of documenting them. So they could learn some of the skills of how to do oral history interviews, how to do the filming and the editing. So we have a sort of pilot website that's up now online, and we're hoping that it'll expand over time. But I think the people who have worked on that project together with me are really seeing that there's a major need for us to document these stories that I think the people of my parents' generation, you know, just assume that they'll continue on. But if we don't tell them, if we don't document them in multiple media, then they get lost, yeah.
So the students who helped you, are they at the university or are they in the high school?
It was a combination of both. We had some UH students, because by that time I was working at UH, and then some Halau Ku Mana students and teachers worked together on it. And so the process for us was as important as the product.
Yeah.
And that actually was some of the most powerful outcomes, I think, were from getting young people who already had a certain level of consciousness together to talk with people like Walter and Loretta and Scarlett Riddy, who, you know, were on those early occupations. And then to talk to them about this same question, like, how did you get politicized? What motivated you to go out and risk your life to protect this island? And kind of demystify, because for people that also do know these figures, you think, wow, they're like amazing, I could never be like that, but they're just regular people too, you know?
Do you want to talk about how you came to political consciousness, or do you feel like it's this process that you went from the teaching, then you went into, you know, from the school? Yeah.
I think it was, I mean, I think it's a lifetime process, you know? My parents were definitely really influential in that. Like I said, they were student activists. They went as students to go, for example, to support farm workers in California in solidarity. They did things here as well, obviously. So I kind of grew up with that. You know, my mom was always working as a practicing social worker in the housings or in child protective services or the sex abuse treatment center. So I got to see, growing up firsthand, you know, that end of the ills of our society that cause these forms of suffering for people, you know, structural inequalities that end up meaning that kids don't have a home, or that there's domestic violence that is fed by this larger structural violence that's taking place. So I don't think I thought about it in that way, but it at least gave me this early kind of sense that there's a lot of injustice in the world and something needs to be done about it.
And that your parents were doing something too, so you realize you have to do something.
Yeah, so that was part of just our kuleana, you know.
And you know, the students at Halau Ku Mana, I've seen them at different rallies. You know, they participate. They actually, they perform too. They'll do something. And there was one time when I think they were opening up Iolani Palace, and when they opened the doors and we went in, and then the students danced.
Yeah.
That was really powerful. I was just crying on this side.
All the graduates that I interviewed talked about how participating in those kinds of community and political actions was really important for them. So a lot of them, you know, were involved in some of the actions around Malamahaloa when there were the protests against the patents of kalo, and then the genetic modification of kalo. And they were, you know, working in Lo'i, so they already had established a relationship with Haloa in that way. And then all of a sudden this issue comes to the fore, you know, that these bills to put a ban on patenting and genetically modifying kalo were coming forth. And so it allowed them to see the political process in a way that you just couldn't see if you were just sitting in a classroom and learning about how do bills make it through the legislature. Like super young, right? That's really boring. But because they had a connection with Haloa and they understood and were practicing around that connection, and then they got to see these actions happening, you know, it really opened their eyes. And then they would also kind of learn critical media reading skills. So they would be at this protest, right? And then they would want to go watch the news so they could see, oh, how did the news report on this? And then they would end up watching the news and saying, that's not what, you know, so-and-so said, or it wasn't like exactly like that, or they put this spin on it. So it's a really powerful way to learn, you know?
Yeah, wow. Today, you know, you want to talk about the Native Hawaiian role, right? Is this what OHA is trying to?
Yeah, so, well, we're here at Halau today, and I'm part of a group called MANA, Movement for Aloha No Ka Aina, and we're a group that supports independence and the creation of meaningful independence on various levels, economic, social, spiritual, political, for Hawaii. And so one of the ways that we contribute to this event at Kalaho'ihoi'ea is to hold a discussion tent on critical issues that are
our people are facing. And so today we have issues like Maile Tawali'i and Lea Aloha are talking about biobanking. Walter Riddy's talking about genetic modification. Auntie Terry Kiko'olani is talking about the military. And so the discussion that I'm facilitating is on the Native Hawaiian Role Commission. And so last year, the state legislature passed Act 195, which because the whole process for federal recognition and the Akaka bill has obviously not been successful over the last 10 years, sort of the state level for that. So it's a state level and state run and state funded process to create a Native Hawaiian governing entity, a reorganized Native Hawaiian governing entity. So the discussion that we're having today is bringing together a member of that commission, Na'alehu Anthony, and a member of the opposition to what the commission is doing, Andre Perez, to discuss, what's the status of the role. So the commission just kicked off the drive to get signatures, and they're calling it Kana'i Olowalu. And so they're encouraging Hawaiians to put their names down. So what this discussion is aimed at doing, and what Mana is trying to do as far as putting questions forward, is that we think that not enough actual in-depth education and discussion has been put forward in order to allow Hawaiian families to have an adequate amount of information to make a good decision. So free and prior informed consent, right? So that's kind of what we're doing, is we're trying to get more information and discussion.
How is this Native Hawaiian role different from the Kauai Noa?
That's a great question. So the Kauai Noa list didn't really have the force of law that this one does. The Act 195 actually created a whole new chapter in the Hawaii Revised Statutes that's called Native Hawaiian Recognition. So it really establishes a very clear kind of state-driven process to reorganize a Native Hawaiian governing entity. And that's the language that they use, right? The Native Hawaiian governing. So it's not the reorganization of a nation or a government or a national government. It's a governing entity. And it's funny that it's called the reorganized, because Native Hawaiians never had a governing entity per se. We had an actual country that had a national government. So that's one of the questions that we'd like to pose, today in the discussion, and that we'd like people in general to be asking is, what does it mean that our kupuna invested our inherent sovereignty in a national government that was independent, that was multi-ethnic, that provided protections for its Aboriginal citizens, but that was also inclusive of non-Oiwi, non-Indigenous people, and then to be now reorganizing this as a ethnically based, state-run entity within the U.S. framework. It's a very different. It's not parallel, and we can't say that that is an expression of our inherent sovereignty.
Yeah. Or Churchill once is saying that when the state organizes it, it's going to be like a neighborhood board level, because you're underneath the state of Hawaii, so it keeps going lower and lower, or less power to do things. Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm interested in, as connected to my involvement and continuing interest in education over the last several years, is what powers would such an entity have over the public education system, in which the largest ethnic group is still Kanaka Maoli. So we make up a fairly small percentage of the teaching force and an even smaller percentage of the principals and the upper level administration of the DOE, but we make up a huge percentage of the students within that system. So would having something like this impact in any way that system, whereas a national government, which we had active for decades, had control of its own national public education system? And that's what the DOE actually, came out of, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I'm interested in hearing from them more about, is what kinds of powers would such an entity have under the state?
That'll be interesting what they say.
Yeah.
Probably zero.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we'll see. I don't know, but
Because, like governments, their power is their ability to tax, right?
yeah.
If you can't tax your citizenry, then you're not really a government, right?
Yeah.
You need a land, you need the ability
Yeah.
to tax and just.
If you don't have the land and an economic base, then you can't exercise any real power.
Yeah.
So, so those are some critical issues that I think are not really being discussed. It's really just being billed as this sort of fluffy, let's reunify, let's come together. And I agree that it's important for Hawaiians to come together, but what are the circumstances under which we're being called to come together? So for example, all of the information that people are turning over in terms of their contact information, their addresses, phone numbers, all of that kind of stuff. Who controls that information? Well, according to Act 195, the state controls that information. So
even with Kauinoa, what happened to all that information? And
Yeah.
since OHA is a state agency,
Right.
the state still controls it
Yeah.
too.
So what they're saying is that the Kauinoa list, all the people that sign up for Kauinoa, will not be automatically transferred over, but that list will be used as like a contact list to encourage people to sign up for the Kana'i Olowalu register. And then there's two parts of it, right? There's the register or the roll, the Native Hawaiian roll, and that's reserved only for ethnic Native Hawaiians. And then there's a petition that anyone can sign regardless of ancestry that says, I support the unification of Native Hawaiian people. So there's kind of, these two parts.
Scary.
Yeah.
I mean, considering the percentage of population, right? Because they can have all these, Asians signing that so it can go this way, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, all these people support it.
Supported it, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that petition will have any sort of force, but it's a way, I guess, for people to feel like they're participating.
Did you bring this up in your classes to discuss for discussion?
It's not something that we were discussing much this past semester, but it's definitely going to be an issue that we'll talk about quite a bit in this year's.
What do your students say, because you teach about, the Hawaiian, the contemporary issues, political issues. How do they read the landscape now? Because it's, like when you talked about when you went through undergraduate, there was a big movement. All these things were moving forward, and now it's a little bit more diffuse or spread. Mm-hmm. What do they say, or this is all they know, so they just go with it, or?
Well, I think that there's a broadening in some ways of the movement, if we can call it like the movement. There's a lot more people, I think, who are open to and supportive of the history and ongoing realities of U.S. occupation of Hawaii. Like, that's something that when I teach about that in my Hawaii politics classes, and students are presented with the facts of of history and ongoing, contemporary realities, it's not something that is really as controversial as I think it would have been at one time. Like, people would just be in denial, like, no, that's not at all. So there's a certain level of consciousness that's there already. I think the next step is, what do we do about that? So there are a lot of students that I come across that are really concerned about issues related to sustainability and food and energy, as those things intersect with issues of ongoing class and racial and inequality for indigenous people. There's just a lot of concern about those kinds of issues. Land, there's still a lot of concern about development and overdevelopment. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's important for me to try to connect students now with these earlier histories from the 70s and 80s and 90s even, is that we still have rampant overdevelopment, paving over prime agricultural lands, and they need to know that communities, that were relatively small, that didn't have a lot of resources, were able to organize and be successful in some cases. And they shouldn't be, intimidated by the fact that they're going up against a corporation that has
Because people in the past did it.
and they were, in many cases successful.
Plus, I guess if they know the history, they can see how the state, like you're saying, before it was just like, no, no. But now the state is more sophisticated in how they say no, right? They're making all these other obstacles, or it sounds like they're saying yes, but they're really saying no, like with the native roll
only on
commission.
our terms. You can have a limited measure of sovereignty within this framework, and so I think our job as educators is to question that frame and to get our students to question that frame, and then to keep pushing, So yeah, that's kind of what we're trying to do today too with the discussion.